limited, and there'll be a few showers through the evening and overnight as well. It's also going to turn blustery here. Heavy and blustery showery rain will then feed across northern parts overnight, staying drier further south with some clear skies. And that's how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
On Mark Dolan tonight, reacting to the big stories of the day, my studio panel, including comedy legends, the Crankies. In the big question, should all Brits have a vote in a future Scottish independence referendum? And my Mark Meets guest is the Queen of rock biographies, Leslie Ann Jones, spilling the beans on the Rolling Stones. And in my big opinion, my verdict on the future of Boris Johnson. See you at 9.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Good afternoon, you're watching GB News. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB Newsroom. We'll start with some breaking news this evening, and Danish police say several people have been hit in a shooting incident at a shopping centre. Officers in Copenhagen are advising people there who are inside the mall to stay put and await police assistance. This is, of course, a developing story, and we'll bring you the latest as soon as we get it. Several new allegations of inappropriate behaviour have been made against the former Conservative MP Chris Pincher. 6 claims, which go back more than a decade, were reported in several newspapers this morning, accusing him of making unwanted advances to male MPs. No official complaints were ever made, and he's denied those allegations. It's just days after he resigned as Deputy Chief Whip and was suspended from the party after allegedly groping 2 men. Mr Pincher says he's currently seeking professional medical support, but he insists he will remain as an MP. The government spending watchdog plans to investigate the Prime Minister's 2019 election pledge to build 40 new hospitals by the end of the decade. It's after the Shadow Health Secretary warned the plans are a waste of taxpayers' money, with many hospitals having alterations or refurbishments instead of being new. Wes Streeting has also criticised delays to the programme, as NHS trusts are still waiting for funds to be allocated. The British Medical Association is criticising government plans to halt sick pay for NHS staff who test positive for COVID. The decision, which comes into effect on the 7th of July, means workers can no longer take special leave to self-isolate. The BMA is warning the move will mean many will still be working despite being symptomatic with the virus. The Department of Health and Social Care says NHS staff have a generous support package with up to 6 months full pay for sick leave and 6 months half pay, depending on the length of service. At least 6 people are reported to have been killed after parts of a glacier collapsed in the Italian Alps amid record high temperatures. Italian media are reporting 8 people have also been injured on the Marmolada Peak in the Eastern Dolomites. Local authorities say rescue efforts are underway, with the number of victims expected to rise. Ukrainian forces have been forced to withdraw from the eastern city of Lysychansk after continued Russian aggression. The city was Kyiv's final stronghold in the Luhansk region, which is now entirely captured by Moscow's forces. Meanwhile, it's reported that at least 6 people have been killed by Russian strikes in the city of Sloviansk. The mayor there said the attacks, which have caused multiple fires, are the worst to hit the city yet. The Ukrainian president says the continued bombardment is brutal.
There is a sense of relaxation in many rear cities now, but the war is not over. It is there. Unfortunately, its brutality sometimes only grows, and we must not forget about it. Brutal hostilities continue along the entire front line. In Donbass, the epicenter, of course, in the cities of Luhansk region. Hostile activity is intensifying in the Kharkiv region.
Thousands of Australians have been ordered to evacuate parts of Sydney after torrential rain brought intense flooding. Vehicles have been left marooned and sports fields turned into lakes, with the Met Office warning the downpour will intensify over the next 2 days. The Emergency Services Minister, Steph Cook, is warning the public not to be complacent.
The Hawkesbury and Nepean rivers will rise higher than what we experienced in March 2021, March 2022 and April of 2022. If you were safe in 2021, do not assume you will be safe tonight. This is a rapidly evolving situation and we could very well see areas impacted that have never experienced flooding before.
And the British theatre and film director Peter Brook has died at the age of 97. He directed famous names including Sir Laurence Olivier and Sir John Gielgud at venues such as the Royal Opera House and the Royal Shakespeare Company. Brook was among the first in theatre to focus on diversity in his productions, winning multiple awards across a 7-decade career in the arts. He died in France, where he'd lived since the 1970s. On TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. We'll have more news at the top of the next hour.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking showery across northern and eastern parts, but drier further south and west. Here are the details. Starting off in the southwest, and here it'll be a fine end to the day with the daytime showers having long died out. There'll be plenty of warm evening sunshine too. Meanwhile, in the southeast, there'll still be a few showers as we head through the evening. Some could be on the heavy side as well. Meanwhile, over in Wales, most of the showers will have cleared away. 1 or 2 are still possible, but for many it will be dry and often sunny. Some showers are set to linger across parts of northwest England and the West Midlands through until the start of the night. The breeze will be picking up too, especially towards the coast. Over in the northeast, we can expect a few heavy showers to end the day. The odd rumble of thunder cannot be ruled out either, though there should be some evening sunshine here as well. Across Scotland, it will turn increasingly windy as heavy, showery rain feeds in from the northwest. Heavier bursts could bring 5 to 10 millimetres of rain in some places overnight. In Northern Ireland, any sunny breaks will be quite limited, and there'll be a few showers through the evening and overnight as well. It's also going to turn blustery here. Heavy and blustery showery rain will then feed across northern parts overnight, staying drier further south with some clear skies. And that's how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News. This is The Political Correction. I'm Arlene Foster, and today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry. So we're here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. This is certainly not about journalists talking to journalists. It's about you telling us what you think. So what's coming up this hour? We are discussing the NATO summit, which took place this week in Madrid, where leaders discussed plans of how to deal with the potential future Russian aggression. We'll be talking about the controversy surrounding Halifax after they told customers they're free to close their accounts with the bank if they disagree with their policy to include pronouns on staff name tags. And we will be discussing babies in Parliament after the Procedure Committee said it was not an environment for very young children. And as ever here on The Political Correction, we want to hear from you. So if you want to get involved in the conversation and have your email read out on the show, then email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is... So NATO leaders met this week in Madrid to discuss Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which commenced back in February. A big talking point was Turkey agreeing to support Sweden and Finland's membership of the alliance, prompting the Kremlin to reinforce their viewpoint that NATO is an aggressive, expansionist organisation with imperialistic ambitions. Before the much-anticipated meeting in Madrid, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that Vladimir Putin would not have invaded Ukraine if he were a woman, claiming that the invasion was a perfect example of toxic masculinity, as he called for more women in positions of power. So, Paul, first of all, let's talk about where we are in Ukraine. How provoking could an expansion of NATO be, do you think?
Well, potentially very. And I'm concerned, Arlene, we're seeing a lot of sabre rattling at the moment, aren't we? We're seeing a lot of stoking of tensions, as far as I can see. I mean, I've said all along the invasion was wrong. It's barbaric. There's no question about that. But I just wonder if NATO and the West and the EU haven't added fuel to the flames in some respects. I mean, I think we're at a position where we need to be looking to dampen the tensions to a certain degree. And some voices have tried to do that, I think, in recent months, not least the likes of His Holiness the Pope, for example. But those efforts don't seem to be making the media and getting much publicity. And it seems to me that the bellicosity and the inflammatory rhetoric is just making things worse. And I think as well, when you look at the overtures that NATO and the EU are now making towards Ukraine, I think if you look at the fact that America is pumping vast amounts of money into Ukraine and arms, and the UK is doing a very similar thing, I think it's making the argument that this is not a proxy war almost untenable. Now, people have got all sorts of different views on Ukraine. Most people agree, rightly, I think, that the invasion by Russia was wrong. But those who say that it isn't a proxy war, I think, are losing the argument, because if you look at the way that the West largely has formed up in ranks alongside Ukraine, and isn't just giving tacit support, but very, very active support in terms of arms and money, etc., then how can we realistically argue that it isn't a proxy war? And I'm also uncomfortable, I've got to say, at the nature of the debate, where all of the angels are being presented as on one side and all of the devils on the other. I mean, there's a whole history to this conflict. It didn't just start in February, it started effectively 8 years ago, and we're not seeing much of that backstory in the media, and that's not helpful.
Yeah, I think that's right. But if you're living in Finland or you're in Sweden, of course you want to be a part of a defence union when you see what has happened in Ukraine, don't you? You want to have that security of being in NATO, and that's why they applied to be a part of NATO.
Well, I don't buy the argument that Russia has got these great kind of expansionist plans that unless the likes of Sweden or Finland were in NATO, then Russia at some point would march in. I mean, there are a particular set of circumstances around Ukraine. There's a historical dispute. You have a large number of ethnic Russians living in the Donbass region. Russia felt rightly or wrongly that those people were being mistreated by the Ukrainian government. So there's a backstory there that doesn't apply to the likes of Sweden and Finland. And I also think the idea that Russia is anything like the kind of power and force of the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, has anything like the wherewithal militarily, economically as the old Soviet Union, or has any of those kind of expansionist plans, I just think he's fanciful. And I think NATO and the EU making these kinds of overtures are just is just ramping up the situation rather than dampening the tensions.
Although you say fanciful, but we all know that Putin has written about, wanting to have a greater Russia and a larger Russia, as in a historical Russia. So, I mean, from my perspective, I can understand why Finland and Sweden, having such a long border with Russia, are concerned about this particular leader of Russia and the way in which he has moved into Ukraine. And you're right, I mean, this didn't start in February, it started back in 2014, or probably before that, if you take your point about what was happening in Ukraine at that time. But 2014, he invaded, very little happened. Then he makes his move in Ukraine, the wider Ukraine, in February. And I think people are worried about what's his next move if he succeeds in Ukraine, and that's why NATO seems to be a comfortable place for Finland and Sweden.
Well, I just don't buy the argument that if Sweden and Finland were not part of NATO, then they would be exposed to a Russian invasion. I simply don't see that happening. I think politically it would be suicidal for Russia to do something like that. I just don't.
Well, you could say that about the invasion of Ukraine, but I mean, he did it anyway.
Yeah, and I think, look, I mean, the truth is, look at how Russia has become bogged down in Ukraine. So I think that itself militates against the argument that Russia is this kind of all-conquering power, potentially. Russia went into Ukraine in February. It's been pushed back from Kiev. It's now concentrating its forces in the eastern region, in the Donbass. All those who said that Russia would roll Ukraine over in a few weeks have been proved wrong. And I think that itself is proof positive that actually, unlike the Soviet Union, which went into places like Czechoslovakia, that went into places like Hungary and rolled those countries over pretty quickly, the mere fact that Russia has been bogged down now for 5 months or whatever it is and doesn't seem to be advancing very far, I think is proof enough that we're not talking about the old Soviet Union. And the example I've used before, Arlene, and I'll use it again, is if for example, the Soviet Union and China decided to enter into Russia and China decided to enter into some sort of military alliance, and a country that was close to the United States, whether it was Cuba or Mexico or Canada, had sympathy towards that alliance and made some sort of security pact with it. Anyone who says to me that the White House in those circumstances would just say, well, that's fine, you're a sovereign country, you're perfectly entitled to enter into whatever military alliance you like, even though it's on our own border, I think he's talking nonsense. We know exactly what the reaction of the White House would be in that situation. And I just don't think we've thought deeply enough about what the response, not just of Putin, but of ordinary Russians, of seeing NATO come closer and closer to its border. Bearing in mind that NATO was set up very explicitly as an anti-Soviet institution. None of that, by the way, I reiterate, none of that is to defend the invasion, which is wrong, which is barbaric, but it is about trying to place it in a greater context than a lot of the media seem willing to do.
Yeah, we should say, of course, there was that horrific attack on Kremenchuk this week when missiles came in from Russia, 1,000 people out shopping in a shopping mall, 13 people dead, many injured. And the barbarity of this war continues, even though I have to say it isn't on our screens as much as it was back in February and March, but the barbarity is still there and it is a war that continues. But just talking about the war continuing, did you see the comments from the Prime Minister where he said if Putin had have been a woman, it wouldn't have happened? What did you make of that?
I mean, I just thought it was complete nonsense, frankly. and he used this phrase, didn't he? Toxic masculinity. And you kind of think, where is he getting that stuff from? Who is feeding that stuff to him? I mean, on a practical level, it's clearly nonsense because there have been women leaders who have gone. I mean, Margaret Thatcher sent an entire task force to the Falkland Islands, for example. And I have to say, I think it's slightly patronising and slightly demeaning to women to say that they wouldn't necessarily be strong leaders. They wouldn't necessarily be willing to use their military in defence of their country. Again, that's not to say that what Putin did was the right thing. But I thought it was nonsense, and you have to wonder...
Well, I was really surprised by it, I have to say, given that the PM always likes to pride himself on his knowledge of history and the fact that Catherine the Great from Russia invaded Ukraine. Well, I mean, sorry. What about Catherine the Great? I felt like saying, but
Yeah,
anyway, I just think it wasn't on.
Exactly, and I just don't think it's helpful, because it doesn't actually allow you to, when you can just dismiss it by saying, well, Putin invaded because he was a man.
Yes.
That to me just seems to dismiss what are what should be very serious contextual arguments about why the conflict exists, why he thought he was right to go in, how we get out of it. Don't reduce it to people's biological sex. It's gone.
No, I couldn't agree more. I thought it was mad. But in any event, staying with Ukraine and what's been happening, the head of the British Army has said that we are facing our 1937 moment. What did you make of that?
Well, I just think it plays into what I said, that actually this kind of rhetoric I just don't think is helpful. I mean, first of all, I don't buy that this is a 1937 moment. I mean, I just simply don't accept that when you compare what was happening in Germany in the 1930s in terms of the very rapid militarisation, in terms of the very, very clear expansionist plans that Germany had under Hitler in terms of the treatment of the Jews, for example. It seems to me that whenever there's a conflict, Godwin's law, isn't it? We always kind of liken it to the Second World War, no matter that there isn't much of a resemblance or an overlap. It just seems to me to be the easy thing that people do. And I just think it's lazy. I think the comparison is trite. I think that what we've got is a conflict in the east of Europe, which I think is sensitive to the facts of that particular conflict, whatever side of the debate you're on, which has a particular set of circumstances, a particular historical backstory, and that the rest of us across the world need to try to help to resolve as soon as possible. The idea that Putin is the kind of threat to us that Hitler unquestionably was, I just think is a glib way of looking at the situation.
Well, I thought it was also not just about Ukraine, but a wider reference to the state of our armed forces and where they're at the moment. And as you know, the Defence Secretary has asked for more money from the Treasury for our Defence Minister. I think it's about 2.2, 2.3 at the moment in terms of GDP. If you go back to 1937, this was a point that Simon Heffer is making in the Sunday Telegraph today. Defence spending in 1937 was at 3.66 of GDP. So it shows you at that, if you like, nadir of where we were before the Second World War, we were actually spending more than we're spending now in defence. And I think that is concerning, is it not?
Well, and our own armed forces over recent years have been ravaged, Arlene. And that slightly worries me that we're throwing around security commitments like confetti. I mean, Boris Johnson said recently that he wanted to invest so much in Ukraine that he could effectively guarantee their protection from invasion in perpetuity, almost. And also, I think, said that Britain would come to the aid of Sweden. Now, OK, you can argue that that's a point of principle, but practically, when we've seen our own armed forces eviscerated over recent years and cut to the bone, are we in any sort of position to be making these sorts of commitments? And I just think that most people's view in this country is that, look, our defence forces are there to react when there is a genuine threat to us. And the other thing, which I found really interesting, is that the government has decided that the spending on Ukraine, the amount it's spending on Ukraine in terms of military support, will be absorbed into the UK's own defence budget and will be considered to be part of the UK's own defence budget. So again, that raises the question, well, how can we realistically argue that this is not a proxy war when we are saying that what we are investing in Ukraine will be considered part of our own defence budget? It seems to me that argument's becoming increasingly unsustainable.
Yeah, so actually, smoke and mirrors, we're not actually spending 2.5% of GDP on our own defence. We're actually spending it in Ukraine. Well, so actually, we're probably spending less on defence if you take that out of it.
Yeah, and I think as well, you can speak to, as I do occasionally, you speak to people in the armed forces and they talk about some of the issues around equipment, some of the issues over pay and conditions. Why have we got a situation where the Prime Minister of this country is throwing around commitments like confetti to other countries, saying, we will come to your aid, when on the ground, in terms of our own armed forces, there is, I think, a serious lack of funding. We've seen them be ravaged over recent years. Soldiers, sailors, airmen don't get the pay that they deserve. Some of those issues, I think, need to be resolved first.
and indeed some of the veterans' issues as well. But no doubt we'll be talking about those for quite some time to come. So coming up after the break, we'll be discussing the controversial decision from Halifax to include pronouns on staff name tags. And of course, we want to hear from you today on the political correction. So if you want to get involved in the conversation, email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at GBNews.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Welcome back to the political correction. So Halifax has told their customers that they're free to close their accounts with the bank if they disagree with their values after some hit out at a policy to include pronouns on staff name tags. The company shared a picture on social media of one of its badges which had Gemma written on it with she, her, hers underneath. And the move was praised by leading LGBTQ plus charity Stonewall as a way to make sure identities are respected. Paul, did we need name tags to make identities respected?
Oh, where's it going to end, Arlene?
I don't know.
Where is it all going to end? I mean, look, I'm a great believer that people should be free to live their lives within the law in the way that they want. And, you know, of course, you want to defend people against any sort of persecution or oppression. But the question that I would raise over this kind of nonsensical debate about pronouns is how much can mainstream society be expected to abandon everything it has ever known and learned in the way of science and biological reality and language and custom, just to indulge the whims of what is a very, very tiny number of people. And the truth is that this kind of gender theory is still very much a hotly disputed theory. And what I find staggering is that so many of our big companies, our public services, our institutions have embraced it almost as if it's some kind of conventional wisdom and peddle it publicly, almost as if everybody is on board with it. And the truth is that not everybody is on board with it, particularly women who see the kind of advance of this genderism and know that it's going to impact in terms of their own safety and security, in terms of their own private single-sex spaces and so on. So the likes of Halifax and HSBC now, who have come out in support of Halifax, I think need to understand that they're really out of kilter with mainstream society on this sort of thing.
And, you know, we were talking about this before we came on air, but HSBC is a global company. They're right across the world. And they will be in places where even homosexuality is not accepted. I'm thinking of places like the Middle East, for example. Yet they preach to us here in the UK, but they wouldn't dare do that in the Middle East. They wouldn't dare do it.
Their principles are selective, in which case they're not principles at all, are they? Because if they abandon their principles when they think their profits might be hit, then they're really not principles to begin with. And actually, you see a lot of companies who will quite happily put the Pride logo on social media, above their own logo. But when it comes to their Middle East branches, they don't do that because they know that actually that might not go down too well. So what you have is companies preaching to us when they think it's fine, it's not going to hit their profits. But if they think it's going to hit their profits, all of a sudden those principles are abandoned, and I don't find that particularly something that should be respected.
And it was good to see Kemi Badenoch, the Equalities Minister, today writing, I think, in the Telegraph again, around the fact that all government buildings are going to have single-sex spaces in toilets. I think that's a good move, isn't it?
I think it's absolutely a good move. And, speaking as a husband and a father, as much as I want to defend people's right to live their lives within the law in the way that they please, and I do, if you say to me that somebody who was born a biological man is going to go into a changing room or to a toilet facility where my 12-year-old daughter is present, then I can assure you I'll be raising a pretty serious fuss about that. And I'd say I think most people in my position would. So, I think she is right to make that point.
I think Kemi has been listening and looking at what's going on and has decided to make this point today, and I think it is a very good point. But we are going to move on to another story in the House of Commons, because this week the chair of the Procedure Committee, Karen Bradley, gave a statement on the committee's report into allowing babies into the Houses of Parliament, reaffirming the guidance that the Chamber, Westminster Hall and standing committees are not environments for very young children. But the group also said that there should be a degree of de facto discretion that should be exercised sparingly. Well, to discuss this story further, we're now joined by councillor and former Conservative advisor, Claire Pearsall. Claire, good to see you this morning. What do you make of this committee's report? Do you agree with the decision?
Yes, I do. I'm so pleased that they've come out with that, because I've long thought that the Chamber of the House of Commons is not a suitable place to have babies. This is a workplace first and foremost. So to take children into the chamber where the most important matters are being discussed is just a distraction. And no other workplace would you see it. So why does it have to apply to the House of Commons?
Yeah, and I agree with that. Obviously, as someone who has had 3 children and has worked in a legislature, I never thought for a moment that it was an appropriate place to bring them into that chamber, not least because I would have been completely distracted and I wouldn't have been concentrating on the job at hand, Claire. That's the point.
It is. And, I have a 13-year-old, and when he was a lot smaller, I did have to take him into the House of Commons to go to work when some childcare fell through at the last minute. But it wasn't the most productive day that I've ever had, and I am so incredibly grateful that my boss let me do it. But it's not something that you can do long term. As an emergency feature, absolutely, women have to do that, parents have to do that if necessary. But to make this a part of life in the House of Commons, I think is just wrong. And as I say, there are many, many parents out there in the country just looking at this saying, I can't do this. I cannot take my child into work. Why should these people be any different? Why are we not looking at childcare arrangements for parents? Surely that's got to be a much better debate to have.
So those who would support bringing children into the chamber, and Stella Creasy is a perfect example, would argue that we're just reinforcing the impression that Westminster isn't a 21st century workplace. That's her argument, Claire. What do you have to say to that?
I do think that she's got some point to make. Westminster is not a normal workplace. It wasn't set up for women. It has changed enormously. And I believe the Procedure Committee's report doesn't state that breastfed babies cannot be taken into the chamber. That is at the discretion of the chair, and that remains so. And there are also other measures put in place. There are proxy voting. There's an uplift in MPs' expenses for more staff to support them on maternity leave. So I do think that this is a little bit of virtue signalling by Stella Creasy at the moment. It isn't necessary and actually brings the debate about women in the workplace back at least 20, 30 years. And that can't be a good thing.
Yeah, so would you agree with me, Claire, that part of the problem with this whole discussion is that if you're an MP, you should get special privileges, whereas if you're working in Tesco's, well, you have to arrange childcare, and that's what you do?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I don't see why MPs should be any more special than anybody else. We have all had to make sacrifices when we have children, whether they be right or wrong. You can debate that matter till the cows come home. But MPs should not be treated as some kind of special entity. Yes, we might need to look at working hours. I think that is ripe for discussion at the moment. But to suggest that they have some kind of special privilege status above everybody else is just wrong.
Yeah. Well, Claire, thank you for giving us your views this morning. It's really good to see you, and thanks for coming on the show. Paul, just briefly, I mean, nobody's denying that there needs to be a workplace in Westminster which can facilitate those who have families, and that creches should be made available at a workplace. But taking a baby into the House of Commons?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're discussing affairs of state in your legislature, then frankly, the idea that you potentially have babies screaming or toddlers running around, I think is just plain silly. So of course you can't have a situation where you have babies and toddlers in the chamber. You wouldn't do it if you were going in to meet your chief executive, if you were having some sort of conference. And I don't see why it should be done there. I mean, it's absolutely right. I think that where employers are able to, they provide decent facilities such as creches. And I think the argument for Parliament to provide a creche right up until the point, because of MPs vote until late in the night in Parliament, if that means that the creche should be opened until late in the night to cater for that, then absolutely right. But no, the babies in the chamber thing, I think, is a nonsense.
Wow. I can think of nothing worse, and I'm sure my children would agree with me as well. But coming up after the break, we will be discussing former Deputy Chief Whip Chris Pincher and, of course, those assault allegations made against him. But as ever, here on The Political Correction, we want to hear from you today. So if you want to get involved in the conversation, do email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us at GBNews.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Welcome back to the Political Correction, and as always you've been getting in touch in a huge number this morning. So here we are. First of all, Adrian says on Putin, I take Paul's point about what if the situation was reversed and a nation friendly to Russia such as Mexico, how would America feel? I do agree. However, I don't think America would invade their neighbour, does Paul? If not, surely the fault is with how Russia has dealt with the perceived slight. Paul?
Well, I would say to Adrian, with respect, if you say that America wouldn't invade its neighbour, then you really don't know anything about the history of American intervention in Central America and South America since the Second World War. America does not shy away from intervening, even not necessarily militarily, but certainly covertly sometimes, in order to get its way. And of course, you know, it's also done it further afield in places like Iraq. On the Halifax pronoun story, Les says, I haven't closed my account. I keep it open with a £2 balance. See how they/her/she likes that.
Yeah,
very good, Les.
They're entering into the spirit of the discussion, absolutely. Peter says on the Halifax pronouns, like so many big companies before them, the Halifax has fallen for the virtue signalling woke nonsense. Why are these companies so desperate to label people? It's causing so much division and anger in society.
You have to wonder if they think they're speaking on behalf of the majority when they do stuff like this. Are they so out of touch with mainstream society that they peddle something thinking that everybody's going to be supportive of them, or they're just perhaps worried if they don't do it that there's going to be a noisy minority who will call for a boycott of them?
And there is a noisy minority, let's be honest about that. You know, when people fall foul of that all the time.
I mean, groups like Stop Funding Hate, for example, very much in the minority, but because they're quite well organised, because they've got a presence on social media, they can whip up a Twitter storm which petrifies some big companies because they think, oh, this could really impact on our profits. So what you end up seeing, and I think this is an example of it with the Halifax, is big companies indulge in the small minority, but vocal minority, because they think they've got more potential to create a backlash against them than the silent majority, possibly. On Babies in the Chamber, Ben says, I do not feel there should be any degree of relaxation for anyone in this. As we've seen all the time, if an exception is made for one, others will say it's discriminatory. Children are not allowed in the workplace, full stop. Work is a place to work, not to parent your children.
Yeah, well, obviously, I've made my views very clear on that. I very much agree with that, Ben. But we're going to move on now and to stay in Parliament and Westminster. Former Deputy Chief Whip Chris Pincher has been suspended as a Conservative MP after allegedly groping two men in a private members' club, and will sit as an independent after he was reported to Parliament's behaviour watchdog. He left his government job on Thursday, saying in a letter that he had, quote, drunk far too much and embarrassed himself and other people. His suspension comes after two senior Conservative MPs, Caroline Noakes and Karen Bradley, wrote to the Chief Whip demanding a zero-tolerance approach to sexual misconduct. 6 new claims of inappropriate behaviour emerged over the weekend. Paul, where does this all end? Where are we going?
I mean, my view, Arlene, is if any MP is guilty of sexual assault in the way that has been alleged here, then you have no place in Parliament, as far as I'm concerned. If you're an MP, you have a duty, I think, to set a higher standard than everybody else. I have been, over the last couple of years, slightly uncomfortable at some of the debate around it, where I felt that things that clearly didn't fall into the category of sexual assault were, in some cases, being treated as that. So, you know, a bit of mild flirting, for example, exchanging text messages, which were perhaps a little bit near the mark, putting your arm around somebody's shoulder. And we saw, you know, in response to some of that stuff, the Me Too movement, where almost any sort of interaction was seen as something that was resembling sexual assault. And I think we need to push back against some of that stuff. However, where the allegations, and if they're proven, are of clear sexual assault, then frankly, get out of Parliament. You cannot do that as an MP. You know, just because you are in a powerful position, it doesn't give you the right to treat people like that. And if you do so, then you've got no place in the chamber, in the Commons, in the legislature.
but we're discussing this all the time. Back in April, you'll remember that Anne-Marie Trevelyan came forward and said that, you know, she'd been pinned against a wall by a male MP. And then Suella Braverman was also talking about the toxic scene at Westminster. Ben Wallace said, you know, it was a toxic mix of factors with alcohol and behaviour. But, you know, it's not about alcohol. It's about holding self-responsibility here, is it not? I mean, that's the key to all of this.
It is, and, you know, I don't want MPs who are snowflakes. I
No.
think if you go into Parliament and you are making important life and death decisions about potentially military action, decisions about the economy that can really impact on people's lives, then frankly you need a thick skin. And I want the debate in Parliament to be robust. I want people to be free to criticise and to attack and to mock if necessary. That's part of what a free Parliament should be about. And I do worry slightly that over recent years we've seen Parliament become almost a bit like a therapy workshop for some MPs, where you see these speeches where they unload their personal problems.
Absolutely.
And I'm uncomfortable with some of that, because all of us, you know, most people in the country have got personal problems to some degree or another and don't necessarily feel that they should spill those out in work. But equally, I think when it comes to things like physical intimidation, when it comes to things like sexual assault, then of course that stuff is completely out of bounds, and anybody who's guilty of it doesn't belong there. And we saw recently, I mean, the number of MPs who are under some sort of investigation because of allegations of sexual harassment. That was quite disturbing. It seems to me to be entirely disproportionate to most other workplaces and most other walks of life. So you do wonder if, when these people get into Parliament, they do think suddenly they're untouchable. You know, they're infused with this feeling that I'm all powerful now and I can treat people how I like. Well, they can't, and they need to understand that.
Yeah, because I think some people have a feeling that this is like the end of the major years, you know, where the Tories were in sleaze and all the rest. But of course, it's not just the Tories that have been involved in this sort of behaviour. Patrick Grady from the SNP, of course, was suspended very recently for behaviour, sexual assault as well. So there is a need, is there not to fall into a moral panic about this. But you're so right about self-control, having responsibility for your actions. And if you step over that line, then you shouldn't be a member of Parliament. Yeah,
and it's, as you said, Arlene, it's not just a Tory thing.
No.
All political parties have had people in their ranks who have been guilty of this kind of thing. And, you know, I don't like it, frankly, when political parties seek to score points and to depict the other party as the one with all of the rotten apples and their own party is whiter than white. That's not the reality of it. You know, politicians need to be careful about going for the jugular on some of this stuff, because it will inevitably come back to haunt them. But yeah, as you said, no place in Parliament for people who step over the line, physically or sexually try to intimidate other people. You know, the Parliament is full of young staffers and researchers and assistants, often, you know, in their first job sometimes or second job, making their way in life. And some of these people may be people who have got designs to become politically active, even MPs themselves. And if their first impression of Parliament is that actually it's a nest of vipers and they're not safe there, then they'll be put off. So that I think needs to be highlighted.
No, I think that's right. Anyway, on Thursday, our political correspondent Tom Harwood sat down for a national exclusive with Brexit Opportunities Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg. They look at the government's response to inflation, the cost of living crisis and the other major issues affecting the UK. Let's take a listen.
This is interesting because it's not something that many of your colleagues in the Cabinet have articulated in terms of how to deal with the causes of inflation. We hear so much about how the government is dealing with the consequences of inflation, but when it comes to those causes, the government hasn't really been saying that it does want fiscal tightening.
It is fundamental to understand the causes, because bear in mind, inflation hits the least well-off in society the hardest. It hits the elderly on fixed incomes, and it hits the young who are just starting on their careers, who don't have a rapidly growing income. And this is really important, that we tackle the causes of inflation. And this is doing things that are difficult to do. I mean, increasing interest rates is hard for people. Tightening fiscal policy is hard for people. Therefore, we need to go further and faster with supply-side reforms, because that's the one thing that ameliorates the otherwise tightening situation. But the Government Bank of England was setting out, I think yesterday, how difficult he sees the economy being. And this is a global problem, that there is a global inflation. It comes from globally loose money policy going back to 2008, and it comes from interruptions in supply chains from COVID. These, I think, the primary drivers. And then, of course, Ukraine on top of that. And I think we need to set out how difficult it is and then what we're doing to solve it so that people understand the decisions that are going to be made and, of course, can help in terms of retained EU law by saying, actually, if you do this, that makes life easier, that makes life more prosperous.
So a really interesting three-pronged approach there. Monetary tightening, fiscal tightening, and supply-side reforms. And those supply-side reforms, which are more your purview than the other two areas, have come under some criticism. Some people say that a lot of these regulations that you point to are trivial, that they don't really add up to all that much. What's your response to that criticism?
1,000 trivial things make something quite substantial. But that's the point, that what the EU did was it strangled enterprise by thousands of pettifogging regulations, each one in and of itself minor, but cumulatively leading to a decline in economic growth and the prospects for economic growth.
So that was Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Brexit Opportunities Minister, telling us about what he thinks needs to be done, and particularly in his role as Brexit Opportunities Minister. Well, sticking with fiscal matters, a handful of wealthy individuals are calling on the world leaders to tackle the cost of living crisis by pushing up taxes for people like them. Speaking during a protest at the World Economic Forum in May, UK millionaire Dr. Phil White said it's outrageous that political leaders listen to those who have the most, but know the least about the economic impact of this crisis. Well, we're delighted to say that Dr. Phil joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Phil. What made you want to get involved with Patriotic Millionaires?
OK, good morning. Really, it was a sense that actually things weren't right and we were hitting working people and the low paid with a lot of tax increases, a lot of pressure on their incomes, if you like, that wasn't justified when I and a number of other people who are actually relatively wealthy and have high incomes could afford to pay more. So it was that injustice, as we saw it, in the sense of fairness, that I wanted to do something about at the end of the day.
And how do you see the organisation intervening in that? How has it helped thus far, do you think, Phil?
Well, I think it's raised the profile of this issue, and this is a big and important thing. And you know, the protest in Davos was a way of getting attention, getting media attention, and making the point to, again, those in positions of power, either because they're more because they've got a lot of money, and with money comes influence and power. And also into the media and so on. So, yeah, absolutely, it's an awareness-raising thing. And since then, we've actually had a lot of interest in this and a lot of support for the cause.
Phil, I have to say, it's quite refreshing to hear wealthy people arguing in favour of paying more tax. You usually hear the opposite. I wonder how many of you are there at the moment? How many within your group are you growing? Are you growing in influence and numbers?
Absolutely. I mean, the Patriotic Millionaires has existed in the United States for a long time, and with various well-known names like Abigail Disney and so on it. We're newer in the UK. We've only got about 10 or 20 members at the minute, but again, there are some very well-known names in there, and we are growing, yes, and we're also looking to grow more across the world, if you like, and actually create this influence. So we're getting a lot of support, and we're not getting a lot of people shouting us down, if you like, which is great.
So, Phil, obviously you felt very personally that you needed to get involved in this organisation and to raise your voice. Just tell our viewers and listeners how you made all of that lovely money that you now have.
Sure. I mean, I worked for my money. My parents were in engineering during the war and so on. I was brought up, I started off in technology research and development, then moved to a consulting company. And through the bonus structure and building up a share of that company, when we sold the company off, I made significant wealth. I'm now very comfortable. I don't frankly need all that wealth. I'm very happy to share it. But again, with Patriotic Millionaires, we need more people to actually do that. And that's why we're calling on a change to the tax system, rather than, if you like, just giving the money away to charity. Because if 1 or 2 millionaires give money to charity, that's one thing, and it has a short-term effect. But actually, if we all do it through the tax system, then that's a very different thing altogether. And we look at raising tens of billions of pounds or more through actually a relatively small tax on wealth.
Well, that's actually the final question I was going to ask you. I mean, why do you need government to intervene? Why can you not give away the money yourself? But I think that you're clear that that's a good thing to do if you want to do that to charities, but you would rather see government get involved directly. Is that your point?
Absolutely. I mean, I work with various charities. I give money to charities, good causes, and we all see homeless people in the street, and we give them money and so on to support them. But yeah, the real power is not when a few wealthy individuals give £1 million or £2 million or whatever to a charity or to a good cause. The real power comes when we put a relatively low rate of tax, and we're talking about a couple of percent above 3.5 million or something. Put a relatively low rate of tax across all the 1% of people who fall into that bracket, and we look at raising tens of billions of pounds. And that way we can really make a difference to the economy, and we can ease the pressure on the low paid and the working people, and rebalance that tax system to a way that actually we think is a lot fairer. So yeah, come on, tax us. We're not going to go hungry.
Dr. Phil White, thank you so much for joining us, a representative of Patriotic Millionaires. Nearly got the words out there. But anyway, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
During the week, the co-creator of legendary sitcom Friends apologised because none of the show's main characters were black. Writer and producer Marta Kaufman said during an interview she's embarrassed she didn't know better 25 years ago, and she's decided to give a university £3.3 million of her own money to fund a new professorship in African and African American studies. Paul, what do you make of all of this?
Well, it's another example of, self-flagellation, isn't it? and look, of course, in the past, we didn't necessarily get things right in terms of the media and the representation of minority groups. But you learn from that and you move forward. But this spectacle of people constantly thinking they have to don sackcloth and ashes and go in for some kind of penance, I think is just tedious, to be honest, and it is now bordering on virtue signalling. And I just wonder as well, Arlene, actually, I think in some respects at the moment we're probably oversteering because, of course, regardless of your background, regardless of your colour and your religion, there should be no barriers on you in terms of rising to the top of your chosen career, in terms of getting on in the media or entertainment and so on. But it seems to me now that if you watch television dramas and adverts and so on, that we're almost now over-representing certain minority groups because we are so desperate to prove our credentials on this point. I use the example of the series about the Larkins based on the Darling Buds of May, which was set in 1950s in rural Kent. And was on ITV last year. It could have been set in Islington in 2021. And in the end, I think it just becomes a bit of a moral lecture and people feel that they're just being patronised. So the focus for me should always be challenge any barriers that prevent people from aspiring to the top of their profession, but don't patronise and don't morally lecture. And I think with the Friends example, that's the kind of territory we're getting into at the moment.
But it's also the hindsight issue. Here's a lady who wrote a very funny, I enjoyed it, Friends sitcom 25 years ago. And now she's going, oh, I should have known better 25 years ago. I should have had somebody in from an ethnic, diverse background. I mean, when you write something and it's there and you sell it to the studio, now you have to say, oh, hold on a second, I should have put somebody in. I mean, to me, that's tokenism of the worst kind.
And I think there's a real danger, and I think we do it all the time in this country, where we apply yesterday's standards to the modern age.
Yeah.
Now, once you get into that game, you are on a very, very slippery slope, because the truth is that social mores and cultural norms change all of the time.
Yeah.
And there will be things that we say and we do now, which in 20 years people will find incredible that we say and we did, and will say, well, that was clearly offensive.
Keep those views coming in. Email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking showery across northern and eastern parts, but drier further south and west. Here are the details. Starting off in the southwest, and here it'll be a fine end to the day with the daytime showers having long died out. There'll be plenty of warm evening sunshine too. Meanwhile, in the southeast, there'll still be a few showers as we head through the evening. Some could be on the heavy side as well. Meanwhile, over in Wales, most of the showers will have cleared away. One or two are still possible, but for many it will be dry and often sunny. Some showers are set to linger across parts of northwest England and the West Midlands through until the start of the night. The breeze will be picking up too, especially towards the coast. Over in the northeast, we can expect a few heavy showers to end the day. The odd rumble of thunder cannot be ruled out either, though there should be some evening sunshine here as well. Across Scotland, it will turn increasingly windy as heavy, showery rain feeds in from the northwest. Heavier bursts could bring 5 to 10 millimetres of rain in some places overnight. In Northern Ireland, any sunny breaks will be quite limited, and there'll be a few showers through the evening and overnight as well. It's also going to turn blustery here. Heavy and blustery showery rain will then feed across northern parts overnight, staying drier further south with some clear skies. And that's how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest